So we're back in Chapter 19 in Michigan's Money and Banking book. In a previous video, we talked about how bad monetary policy can generate very high rates of inflation. Well, now what we want to do is look at the link between monetary policy and fiscal policy. In other words, the government's spending and taxing policies and inflation as well. And we want to see here, is it possible that bad fiscal policy can also lead to inflation? So under certain circumstances, what we'll discover is that the answer to this question right here is yes. Again, under certain circumstances. But other circumstances, bad fiscal policy won't lead to inflation. So how can we demonstrate this? Well, here's what we need to start with. Let's start with what we call the government's budget constraint. Now, again, that seems like an oxymoron. I mean, you know, if we look at any level of government, it seems like all they do is spend, spend, spend. Well, just like any entity, they do, in fact, have a budget constraint. And it's really very straightforward. And the way we can set it up is like this. We imagine that if we define the deficit as the difference between what the government spends and what it takes in tax revenue, that's a very straightforward definition. It turns out that we can break that deficit into two components. Something that we're already familiar with. Remember, we've already talked about what the monetary base is when we were discussing the money multiplier and the money supply. So if we take change in the monetary base and add that to the change in the bonds issued or sold by the government that are held by the public, that also, it turns out, as we'll see, has to equal the size of a government's budget deficit. Now, what we can do then is we can take that equation and think along these lines. Suppose the government wants to spend an additional $1 billion. So it wants to spend an additional $1 billion. Well, it has a combination of three options to pursue that additional spending of $1 billion. It can do some combination of raising taxes, borrowing, or, as we'll discover, increasing the money supply. So by raising taxes, it'll increase tax revenue. By borrowing more, it'll increase bonds outstanding held by the public. And if it increases the money supply, it'll increase the monetary base. And so what we want to investigate is, can any of these generate inflation? So in other words, does it matter how the government finances its spending in terms of how that affects inflation? Well, let's see. So let's think about these one at a time here. And in the extreme case, let's do this. Let's suppose that that entire $1 billion of additional spending is financed by a $1 billion increase in tax revenue of some form or another. Now here, for our purposes, we don't care very much about the details of what types of taxes are increased. All we care about here is that they are increased by a matching amount to finance that additional spending. And so what we observe is this. It's kind of obvious, but humor me here. Well, we observe no change in the government deficit because spending and taxes have both gone up by $1 billion. But what's more important and not quite as obvious, and this is what we need to think about, is this, is that throughout the entire economy, there probably hasn't been much of a change in total spending. Because think about what's happened. We have observed an increase in government spending by $1 billion. So if you go back to basic, let's go back to basic C plus I plus G plus NX is equal to real GDP, aggregate demand of the economy. Well, we observe that government spending has in fact gone up. Well, that doesn't mean, however, that final spending has gone up by $1 billion. Because think about this. In order to generate $1 billion worth of tax revenue, what probably happens is that reduces spending in the private parts of the economy. For example, that might reduce consumption spending. As some of our income gets taxed away, we reduce consumption. That might reduce C. Well, if they raise taxes on companies, investment might decline possibly, for example. And so it could be the case that the total decline in private spending is exactly matched by the increase in public spending, so that aggregate spending within the economy roughly zeroes out. The idea being that total spending will be affected maybe a little bit or possibly maybe not even at all. Finally, what happens, or doesn't happen in this case, there isn't any change in the money supply. Now, who's spending the money possibly has changed, but there isn't any aggregate change in the money supply or therefore aggregate spending. So here's the bottom line in this case. Since total spending hasn't changed, and since the monetary base and therefore the money supply hasn't changed, it's probably very likely that financing spending through taxes won't generate any inflation. Okay, so taxed finance spending is not a good candidate for generating inflation. Well, what about borrowing? Suppose instead of raising taxes to finance that $1 billion in spending, what happens if the government instead borrows it? So they go out into the financial market and they go out and they sell $1 billion worth of bonds, and they use the proceeds of that bond sale to go out and finance that additional spending. Well, now here it's pretty obvious. Since government spending has risen and tax revenue has not, the size of the deficit has obviously gone up. Again, fairly obvious, but humor me here. So now we've at least got the deficit. So maybe we've got a chance for some inflation. But here's the thing. Total spending, again, just like in the previous example, more likely than not hasn't gone up by very much. Maybe not at all. Here's the reason. When the government goes out and borrows money from us in the financial system, it takes away our spending power. Now, granted, it's a voluntary exchange. Consider this. Unlike the previous example where taxes rose, that was sort of involuntary. Here, it's voluntary. We're voluntarily lending the government money for them to go out and spend. So we're giving them the money. They're giving us little IOUs. So they're borrowing, in effect, $1 billion worth of spending power from the private sector. And then they'll go use that to fund government spending. So crucial point here is, just like before, total spending is probably left unchanged. Public spending has risen. Private spending, though, has fallen by a roughly similar amount. So again, the aggregate spending hasn't been affected. And just like before, there isn't any change in the monetary base. So here's the crucial point with borrowing. As long as government spending is financed by strictly borrowing, that's also probably not inflationary. Now, this is not to say, the final little point here, this is not to say that deficits don't have other knock-on side effects. For example, an increase in government spending that's financed by borrowing could, as we discussed in another video, could push up interest rates, and that could crowd out private consumption and private investment. So there could be negative effects, but very likely inflation is not one of them. So to summarize here, government spending financed by tax increases, government spending financed by borrowing are probably not inflationary. So those first two aren't good candidates. Well, what about the last option? What about printing money, so to speak? Well, suppose this. Suppose a government either for some reason can't or won't raise taxes to finance its spending, and can't or won't borrow to finance its spending. Well, here's the thing. Think about it from our point of view, a personal point of view. Well, if we as people want to increase our spending, we either have to go out and work more to generate more revenue, or we have to go out and borrow. So we've got credit cards, for example. Or if we're not going to do those sort of legitimate things, then we go out and we steal things, or maybe we outright counterfeit. If we've got a really good color printer and we have some good scanning software. Well, here's the thing, is governments, they have a third option that we don't have. Governments sometimes have the ability to control the money supply. To the extent that they can do that, they can, without exaggeration, print their way to financing their additional spending. So let's see how this might work. Well, the most obvious one is simply, literally, to turn on the printing presses and print additional currency to pay its bills. So if the government spends an additional $1 billion, it runs the printing presses for a few extra minutes, prints a whole bunch of extra $100 bills, and then uses those to finance its spending. But there's a less obvious and probably more practical one, or a practical way to do this. Instead of physically printing new currency, here's another thing a government could do. They could sell bonds directly to the country's central bank. So instead of selling bonds to the public, folks like me and you, they sell it directly to the central bank. So let's think about that exchange. It works pretty simply. So the bonds go to the country's central bank. In exchange, the central bank pays for those bonds simply by crediting the government's accounts. So if the government sells $1 billion of bonds directly to the central bank credits the government's checking account with an additional $1 billion. So now the government has an additional $1 billion in its checking account, and it can go off and use that $1 billion to pay its new bills. Here's the crucial thing. If a central bank does that, that effectively increases the money supply, increases the monetary base. And this has a special name. This is called monetizing the debt. So the idea is we have new additional spending in the economy. Unlike the previous two examples, where we had the government financing additional spending by raising taxes or borrowing, here we've got additional spending because spending wasn't drained out of the private sector through raising taxes. Private spending wasn't drained out by increasing borrowing from the private sector. So we've got new spending. Plus, we've got an increase in the monetary base. And as a result, no matter what, we end up with inflation if something like this is done on an extended basis on a large volume for a long period of time. And this, for example, is what happened recently in Zimbabwe, is that the government was unable to raise sufficient tax revenue to pay its bills and was unable to borrow in financial markets to pay its bills. So by process of elimination, through sort of desperation, they ended up turning on the printing presses and creating trillions and trillions of dollars of their new currency, to the point where you saw in the previous video there that they ended up with a bill that was worth, that was denominated as $100 trillion, but turned out to be worth actually very little. Now, what I want to close with here is this. In the United States, there's a clear distinction in terms of what the United States Treasury does and what the Federal Reserve does. So we're going to make a clear distinction here. So the Treasury has its responsibilities. It's in charge of printing the currency, minting the coins, selling the new government debt, in other words, borrowing money, and actually writing the checks to pay the government's bills. So the Treasury has a lot of important functions, obviously. The Fed, country's central bank, well, they're in charge of putting new currency in circulation, and they buy and sell existing government securities. In other words, securities the government has already sold to the public. And this separation in terms of who gets to put the currency in circulation and who prints it sets things up so that the Treasury cannot print new money to pay its bills. And most governments have organized themselves like this, where they have that separation of responsibility. And the idea is really simple for this, is that printing money is the quick, easy, sort of the dark side way of financing spending. It's much more difficult politically and economically to raise taxes and to borrow. It's way easier to print money. But because the cost of that is raising inflation, potentially, governments have sort of set themselves up so that they don't do this. So here's what we learned here today. We already knew that bad monetary policy causes inflation, but now we know that bad monetary policy can result from bad fiscal policy. And so here's a crucial question we want to think about. And again, this is a topic for a future video. So wouldn't it be a really great idea if the central bank was made independent from the rest of the government? In other words, the part of the government that spends money, so that so that we don't observe the central bank simply being sort of the handmaiden of the government and printing new money to pay the government's bills, because that, as we saw, results in inflation. Thank you all very much.